Hey, Steve here again. I have a really fun announcement today. I have mentioned a few times before that we are now on Scott Rank of the History Unplugged. It's a new podcast network, Parthenon Podcasts. Other charter members include James Early and his Key Battles of American History podcast. Today I'm featuring a sample episode from the newest member of the podcast network, Parthenon Podcast. This podcast is called This American President. The presidents of the United States were and are some of the most powerful men who've ever lived. They've waged war, forged peace, and altered the fates of billions of people. And yet, they are just as human and as flawed as you and me. They are the presidents of the United States and are subjects of the history podcast, This American President. The power of the presidency is more than any one person can bear, and perhaps should bear, yet Americans entrust that power to a single individual every 4 years. In each episode of This American President, Richard Lim explores how flawed men have managed this awesome responsibility and sought to live up to the ideals of the American experiment. And Richard examines what the lessons of history can teach us about our world today. This American President is hosted by Richard Lim and produced by Michael Neal. You can learn more about This American President at parthenonpodcast.com or in the show notes. I hope you enjoy this teaser of This American President, and I'll talk to you soon.
What do you think of when you hear the name George Washington? Do you think about the famous story of him chopping down the cherry tree? Or the fact that he was the first president of the United States? Or that his face is on the $1 bill? 217 years after his death, George Washington can seem more like a myth than a real person, more monument than man. And some might even call him boring. We learn that he was a man of integrity, and we yawn. Perhaps in our cynical times, we prefer our leaders a bit more complicated and a bit more human. In the first episode of This American President, we will explore the real George Washington. Indeed, he was a real human being who, like anyone, was flawed, had quirks, and made mistakes. But I hope you'll find that he was anything but boring. In fact, this George Washington might surprise you. You know that he was our first chief executive. But did you know that Washington, the dour old man on the dollar bill, was actually an action hero? My name is Richard Lim, and I've spent much of my life studying the presidents of the United States. I even worked for one and had the privilege of seeing him up close. My friends and I started this podcast so that I could share this passion with others. We've had 45 presidents, and each one represents a unique chapter in our nation's history. Those chapters are filled with triumphs and tragedies, successes and failures. Some of our presidents were brilliant, and others were just plain bizarre. But they all have a story to tell and help to shape the country we have today. And now, we will explore one of those stories on this episode of This American President. Many years ago, when I was in between jobs, I worked at Mount Vernon, the place where George Washington lived. I was a tour guide, and when I talked to guests, I found out that all that most people knew about him was that he was the first president. Every kid in America can answer that it was George Washington. But that's about all they can say. It's like he's become an answer to a trivia question and nothing more. Now, George Washington is not unique in that respect. There are lots of great leaders who have been reduced to trivia questions. When it comes to even our greatest leaders, we usually sum up their entire lives in just 1 or 2 sentences. With that said, George Washington poses a unique dilemma. On one hand, he may be the most famous American of all time, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's on the dollar bill for crying out loud. But there's something about him that seems a bit distant or elusive, even more than our other presidents. Sure, part of that is the passage of time. He was our first president, so it's only natural that we remember the most recent presidents instead. But it isn't just that. Abraham Lincoln died almost 60 years before Calvin Coolidge was president, but which one are we more familiar with? Who is easier to picture in our heads? The point is, there is something especially distant about Washington. I mean, do you really feel like you know him? Can you picture what meeting him would be like? I mean, just look at Washington's monument. It is literally a giant slab of stone. It tells us almost nothing about the man, maybe except that he was important. Compare that to the Jefferson and the Lincoln memorials, where you actually get to see a statue of them and read the words that they wrote. But this brings up an interesting question. Why does Washington seem so distant? Part of it was his personality. Those who knew him said that he just didn't talk much about himself. There is, I suspect, another reason for why we don't seem to know Washington. And that reason may be something as simple as the way he looks in the paintings. When you picture Washington in your head, what do you see? Well, most people will imagine the portrait of him on the dollar bill. We all know this famous image. It was made from a painting by Gilbert Stuart. It's probably the most famous image of Washington. It's one of the most iconic American images of all time, along with the American Gothic painting and the arch for the McDonald's logo. The painting dates back to 1796, which also happened to be at the end of his presidency. This time, he was a 64-year-old man. He had almost half a century of service to his country under his belt. This is actually a good time where we can take measure of his career, at least the part when he was on the national stage. Washington served as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the American Revolution for 8 years. In that capacity, he was basically our head of state, the leader of our country. He then served as the president of the convention that produced our Constitution in 1787. Finally, he served as our first president for 8 years. If you total up the years that he was at the top of American affairs, that's 16 years. If you total up the years that he was the foremost American from the start of the war in 1775 to his death in 1799, that's 24 years. That's double FDR's 12 years at the national level. It's longer than any other American leader in our country's history. When the war ended, Washington felt like he had done his duty. After all, he was the man who won American independence. He famously just wanted to go home to his farm and his family. But the nation kept calling him back. Usually when people become president, they are elated and have achieved their life ambition. When Washington became president, he took office reluctantly. So reluctantly that he described feeling, and I quote, like a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. He then had tried to retire after his first term, but his advisors, namely the other founding fathers, simply said that he had to stay. Imagine having to be stuck in a job you didn't like for 8 years, plus that the fate of your country rested on your shoulders. So when you look at that portrait of Washington on the dollar bill, what you see is someone who is just exhausted, not just from a long day at work, but from a lifetime at work. But this portrait seems to tell us more. If you have a chance, Google it. Just type in unfinished portrait of George Washington. In that painting, he not only looks old, but quite frankly, he looks a little ticked off. He looks like someone who, at the least, is highly displeased, maybe even disappointed. And it makes me wonder, who is he disappointed in? Is he disappointed in us? There's just something about that gaze that can make you feel a bit guilty. But about what? Well, that is the image of Washington we have decided to use. It's how we remember him. It's the one that is on our dollar bill, the thing that we print 19 million times a day. 19 million portraits of Washington every day. And he looks old, ticked off, disappointed. Have you ever followed a famous athlete throughout their career? Now bear with me here, I like sports analogies. Well, if you've ever followed an athlete for a long time, eventually they might keep playing past their prime. You start noticing that the younger generations of fans only know that athlete in their later years, and they never saw them when they were at their best. Well, in the same way, in these portraits, we are seeing George Washington past his prime. And it's a shame, too, because that wasn't the man many of his contemporaries knew. Now, the rest of this episode will explore the real George Washington. And you might be surprised to find out that he was less the man on the dollar bill and more of, well, an action hero. So let's go back in time to 1754 to find out just who this action hero is. During this time, the British and the French were jockeying for supremacy in North America. It was in the woods of what we now call Pennsylvania that Washington, at the age of 22, got his first taste of combat. Picture an ambitious young man with an intense craving for adventure, kind of like a colonial version of Luke Skywalker. The royal governor of the colony sent the young Washington and a group of Native Americans on a critical mission to hold a patch of land against the French. It was probably too big a responsibility to put on a 22-year-old's shoulders. Well, during this mission, Washington's men confronted a party led by a French envoy named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. I won't get too much into the details, but basically an ambush ensued. Although what happened is debated to this day, we do know that the event was short and bloody, and that in the end, Washington and his men were victorious, and Jumonville was dead. It was said that the chief who accompanied Washington cracked open Jumonville's skull and rinsed his hands with the man's blood and brains. Later, when recapping the incident, Washington wrote to his brother and said, and I quote, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound." Now, charming is probably the last word we would use to describe something that gruesome. Maybe it was the rush he felt after his first taste of combat. Maybe he was just showing off to his brother and cultivating the image of a young heroic soldier. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Either way, we get a glimpse of a young George Washington, and he had a bit of swagger. You might even call him cocky. Now, Washington may have found his first combat experience exhilarating, but the incident had consequences he probably never expected. See, at the time, he was a junior colonial officer serving the British Crown, and his reckless actions provoked the French to retaliate. After all, his party basically killed a French diplomat. And this sparked what would become known as the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, or what we Americans like to call the French and Indian War. In case you missed it, let's take measure for a moment of what that means. George Washington, at the age of 22, helped to start what would become an international war between two empires. I always wondered, what did that feel like for young George? And even though he was on the British side, not everyone in London was happy about this. British statesman Horace Walpole later said, and I quote, that it was a volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America that set the world on fire. It was not the last time George Washington would be a source of frustration for the British. Let's fast forward a year. It is now 1755, and we find George Washington as an aide to the new commander-in-chief of the British Army in America, General Edward Braddock. The British sent Braddock to North America specifically to eject the French from what was called the Ohio Territory. He planned to attack the hub of French power in the region, Fort Duquesne, which was located in what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The only problem with this plan was that the British had sent the wrong man. General Braddock, by all accounts, was a bit of a jerk. He was temperamental and stubborn. He would never lower himself to listen to his colonial subordinates, and that includes Washington himself. That's a problem when your subordinates know the landscape better than you do. And he wasn't just a jerk. He also didn't know how to fight, at least not in North America. He may have known how to fight in Europe, where we have large set battles in open fields, but this is North America. Picture rugged, undeveloped terrain and narrow roads. The 24-year-old Washington advised Braddock to travel lightly, which makes sense in that kind of territory, but Braddock refused. For a man as ambitious as Washington, it must have been galling to see his superior act so dismissively. Even worse, by ignoring their advice, Braddock was exposing his men to unnecessary risks. Now it's July 1755. Imagine about 1,300 British regulars and colonial militia laboring through the woods on a hot summer day near the Monongahela River. They were exhausted after weeks of strenuous marching. Now Washington himself was in really bad shape since he was plagued with a fever and headaches. His condition was so bad that he actually spent several days lying down in a covered wagon. So you can imagine the misery of traveling through bumpy roads in the intense summer heat in that condition. And it was in this setting on July 9th where the British advance guard spotted French soldiers and their Native American allies in the trees. Shots rang out. The men in the trees charged and began attacking the main body of Braddock's army. And the British, because of Braddock, were totally unprepared and on the defensive. Before long, confusion reigned, and some British men actually began firing at each other, and many fell victims of friendly fire. Even worse, they gazed in horror as Native Americans killed several of their fellow soldiers and pinned their scalps up on the trees. Now, Braddock and his men tried to hold the line and organize some form of resistance, but they couldn't stop the slaughter. The French and their allies poured musket fire onto the British for hours. The redcoats were dropping like flies. Blood stained the ground, and several British soldiers ran away and hid behind the trees, doing anything to escape the carnage. Those who were dying of bullet wounds cried in agony, but found no relief. For them, there was no escape. So whenever I read about this battle, I think about how bad the situation must have seemed to those British soldiers. It's kind of like when you're watching your own team in a game. Yes, another sports analogy. And they're just getting blown out, and the whole game is a waste and you regret watching it. And you get to the point where the only thing you can hope for is to save some face and make the game somewhat respectable. But either way, you know that the night is a loss. And yes, my analogy is a poor one because the situation is much worse because it's combat and people are actually dying. And what was at stake was the fate of empires. But you get the picture. It's about as bad a situation as you can get. But it was in this nightmarish setting that an ailing and weakened George Washington sprung atop his horse and went to work. Despite his illness, Washington was ready. It was as if he was made for moments like these. He rode back and forth across the battlefield for hours as his fellow soldiers were falling, and he organized some semblance of a rear guard. Somehow Washington was able to impose some form of order, allowing the British to retreat and cut their losses. The fighting continued for hours. Bullets were flying all around him, but nothing, whether it was illness, exhaustion, or even musket fire, could stop him. In the midst of the chaos, Washington actually fell violently to the ground. His horse had been shot. Though weakened, Washington jumped on another horse. Eventually, he fell again. Another bullet had taken out his second horse, and yet Washington remained unscathed. Bullets kept whirling all around him. At some point, he finds holes in his hat and uniform. Apparently, 4 bullets had struck his clothes. 4. They actually struck his clothes, but not Washington himself. While death surrounded him, those who saw Washington actually felt that he had an invisible aura of protection around him. Although the battle lasted for hours, it was clear that the British were vanquished. They began that day with 1,300 men. By the end of the battle, half of them had perished. It was becoming clear, however, that that number would have been higher without young George Washington's efforts. Unfortunately, General Braddock himself was shot in the lung. As he lay dying, he ordered Washington to send word to another British division 40 miles away for aid. This meant that, for Washington, his work was not over. Though exhausted from illness and hours of combat, he rode all night through the woods to that division for help. When it was all said and done, the Braddock expedition was a disaster for the British. Braddock was dead, and the myth of their invisibility had been shattered. A lesson the colonials would never forget. However, in the midst of that defeat, a legend was born, especially among those who witnessed it. I like to compare it to an up-and-coming athlete who has some incredible performance, and regardless of whether their team won, you realize that one day they're going to be something special. Well, this was Washington's big moment. It was as if the world was put on notice about him. George Washington, once the reckless provincial who started a war, had demonstrated indomitable courage in the face of certain death. And it wasn't just that, the whole thing seemed a bit supernatural. James Craik, Washington's lifelong friend, witnessed his heroics that day. And he later marveled, saying, and I quote, "I expected every moment to see him fall. Duty and station exposed him to every danger. Nothing but the superintending care of Providence could have saved him from the fate of all around him." Shortly after the battle, Presbyterian minister Samuel Davies said that he had hoped, and I quote, "Providence has preserved him in so signal a manner for some important service to his country." Now, when you start talking about the supernatural, you can't help but think about things like destiny. And it was at the Monongahela where people began to believe that George Washington was destined for great things. Several years later, according to Dr. Craig, Washington encountered a Native American chief who remembered seeing him at the Battle of the Monongahela. By this time, Washington had retired from the military and was a farmer with a family and 2 adopted children. That chief told Washington that he had ordered his men to shoot at him, but were stunned when none of their bullets hit their target. Because of this, the chief was convinced that a great spirit was protecting Washington, and told him that, and I quote, "he will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the father of a mighty empire." He told Washington this just a few years before the American Revolution. Now, the Battle of the Monongahela was a milestone in George Washington's life story. That hot July day, however, would leave him with memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he later wrote, and I quote, "The dead, the dying, the groans, lamentation, and cries along the road of the wounded for help were enough to pierce a heart." For Washington, the sounds of war, of dying soldiers, were losing their charm. It was a sound that he would become all too familiar with. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal. If you like what you've been hearing, you can help us by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to our show. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with more This American President.